Jason Beaumont had 13 children with his own minor daughter. Revealed inside Louisiana, he was the most endogamous man ever uncovered. This is a story as real as it is disturbing, a tale involving generations of isolation and family practices that challenge human nature itself. It was 1976, when the Street Landry County authorities in Louisiana received an anonymous complaint concerning an isolated property deep in the swamps. Approximately 40 kilometers from the small town of Opelousas lay a place locals had avoided for decades, a property surrounded by stories whispered only in low tones in local bars. The Beaumont farm had existed in that marshy region since the late 19th century, settled there after the Civil War by Jeremiah Beaumont, a lonely and suspicious man, and his young wife. What would become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing stories of family endogamy ever documented in the United States was, at the time, a secret to all. Born in 1932, Jason Beaumont was the third generation of the family living on that property. The son of Theodore Beaumont and his first cousin Eleanor, Jason grew up with practically no contact with the outside world. The family remained in isolation, cultivating just enough to survive and avoiding any interaction with the local community. Martha Thibodeau, a young woman from an equally secluded family a few miles away, was married by Jason in 1953. 4 children were born to Martha, with Sarah, the youngest, arriving in 1959. The Beaumont family established itself in a particularly isolated region of the swamps, explains local historian Dr. Raymond Doucet, who studied the family genealogy. While it was not uncommon for families to live in relative isolation in rural Louisiana at that time, the Beaumonts took this to an extreme. They rarely appeared in town, and when they did, they avoided any social interaction beyond the absolutely necessary. Jeremiah and Catherine had 6 children, only 3 of whom reached adulthood: Thomas, Rebecca, and William. Parish records show that in 1890, Thomas married his sister Rebecca in a ceremony officiated by Jeremiah himself, who cited distorted biblical passages to justify the union. From this marriage were born 4 children, including Theodore, Jason's father. Theodore, in turn, married his cousin Eleanor, the daughter of William. The couple had 3 children: Jason, Marie, and Robert. Marie died as a child due to congenital heart complications, while Robert had serious cognitive and physical limitations, common characteristics in advanced cases of endogamy. What we see in the Beaumont family is a consistent pattern of consanguineous marriages over at least 4 generations, explains Dr. Elaine Morrow, a geneticist at the University of Louisiana. When close relatives have children, the likelihood of harmful recessive genes expressing themselves drastically increases. In a normal population, these genes rarely cause problems because they need to be inherited from both parents. However, in families with a high degree of consanguinity, this probability increases exponentially with each generation. Dr. Morrow continues, the Beaumont case is particularly tragic because we are not just talking about an isolated case of endogamy, but a systematic practice over several generations. Jason's coefficient of consanguinity was already extremely high due to his family history, and his children with Sarah represent one of the most extreme cases of documented endogamy. When Jason took control of the property after his parents' death in a 1952 fire, he already carried the weight of generations of isolation and endogamic practices. His marriage to Martha Thibodeau, while not to a known direct relative, occurred within an extremely limited social circle. Subsequent investigations would suggest the Thibodeau family possibly had distant ties to the Beaumonts, making the coefficient of consanguinity even more complex. The 4 children from Jason and Martha's marriage, Michael, John, Emma, and Sarah, already showed signs of genetic problems. Michael had a spinal deformity that gave him a hunched appearance. John suffered from a form of dwarfism and had limited cognitive development. Emma had severe vision problems, being practically blind by age 10. Sarah, born in 1959, was the one with the least obvious physical problems, though later medical reports indicated she suffered from slight cognitive retardation and had an extreme docility and inability to contest situations, characteristics that would become fatally relevant in the coming years. In 1962, when Martha died during childbirth, the Beaumont family became even more isolated. Jason, in mourning and with 4 young children to raise, withdrew almost completely from any outside contact. It was in this environment of extreme isolation, permeated by generations of endogamic practices and social disconnection, that the horror would reach its peak. The exact beginning of the improper relationship between Jason and his daughter Sarah remains hazy in the official records, but testimonials collected during the investigation suggest it began around 1973 when Sarah was about 14 years old. Her older brothers, Michael and John, had left the property years earlier, Michael to work on oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico, and John to live with an isolated religious community that accepted his limitations. Emma, almost completely blind, depended entirely on her father and sister to survive. According to testimony she provided years later to social workers, she knew something was wrong, but her dependence and the isolation imposed by Jason made any intervention impossible. The first child from the relationship between Jason and Sarah was born in 1974 when she was only 15. Over the next 3 years, she would give birth to 3 more children, all presenting severe developmental problems. When the authorities intervened in 1976, Sarah was pregnant once again. What we found on that property was the result of generations of isolation and endogamic practices taken to the extreme, explains forensic psychologist Dr. Catherine LaRump, who worked on the case. Jason Boemp grew up in an environment where the normal borders between family relations had been completely distorted. For him, this behavior was not deviant, it was simply the continuation of a family standard. One of the investigation's most disturbing discoveries was Jason's diaries, which revealed a profoundly distorted worldview based on a mixture of superstitions, extremely peculiar religious interpretations, and pseudoscientific notions about the purification of family blood. In one entry from 1973, he wrote, "Beaumont's blood is special. We have to keep it pure. The world outside is contaminated. Sarah understands that now. To you who are watching, we say this: social isolation can lead to the destruction of an entire family." This phrase reflects the tragedy we are witnessing in this story. It makes us reflect on the importance of healthy social ties for human development. The investigation revealed that Jason had absolute control over the property. A high fence surrounded the perimeter, and the few neighbors who tried to approach over the years were met with hostility and threats. The nearest house was more than 4 kilometers away, and the family rarely went to town. It was as if that property existed in a parallel reality, reports Harold Jenkins, one of the few traders who occasionally interacted with Jason when he came to town for supplies. Everyone knew there was something strange about the Beaumonts, but no one wanted to get involved. There had been stories about them for decades, but people just preferred to keep their distance. When asked why he never reported his suspicions, Jenkins replied, "At that time, in that region, you didn't get into the affairs of others, especially if those others had the reputation of the Beaumonts." As the children from the relationship between Jason and Sarah came into the world, the genetic effects of extreme consanguinity became increasingly evident. Of the 13 children born by the time of the police intervention, 15 were alive, including twins from the last birth, but all had serious health problems. 4 had polydactyly, extra fingers or toes. 6 had significant facial deformities. 9 had some degree of cognitive impairment. 5 suffered from the complaint that led the authorities to the Beaumont property came from a hunter, George Landry, who, lost in the swamps during a storm, approached the house seeking shelter. What he glimpsed through the windows was enough to send him to the local sheriff's office as soon as he returned to town. "I have never seen anything like it," Landry said. "There were children everywhere. Many of them looked not natural. It was like being in another world, a place where something had gone terribly wrong." When Agent Reynolds entered the property in July 1976, he began the dismantling of a horror cycle that had endured for generations. But the real challenge would be dealing with the human consequences of this family tragedy. The authorities' intervention on the Beaumont property in July 1976 triggered an unprecedented social assistance operation in St. Landry County. The 15 children found in the house, 13 born from the relationship between Jason and Sarah, plus Emma, Sarah's sister, and a newborn baby whose parentage couldn't be immediately determined, were immediately removed for medical evaluation. Dr. Thomas Williams, the pediatrician who coordinated initial care, described the situation as the most extreme case of medical neglect and genetic damage from consanguinity I have encountered in my 30-year career. Many of the children had never received any medical care. Some had treatable conditions that had been left unattended for years, significantly aggravating their problems. Beyond the obvious genetic issues, there was malnutrition, parasitic infestations, and signs of prolonged exposure to unhealthy conditions. The case's impact was so significant that an entire wing of the Lafayette Regional Hospital was temporarily designated for the Beaumont children. Specialists from New Orleans and universities from other states were consulted for the most complex cases. The eldest son of Jason and Sarah, then 12, had a rare combination of genetic conditions, including a severe, untreated form of craniosynosis that resulted in permanent cognitive impairment. 3 of the youngest children suffered from a rare cardiac condition requiring emergency surgery. Jason Beaumont was immediately arrested and charged with multiple crimes. Sarah was hospitalized for medical treatment and psychological evaluation. The question of her legal responsibility became a central debate in the subsequent judicial proceedings. Sarah Beaumont represented an extremely complex case from a legal and ethical standpoint, explains lawyer Charles Duper, who assisted the district prosecutor. On one hand, she was clearly a victim. On the other, she was, in a technical sense, an accomplice in the negligence of the children. However, psychological evaluations and her family history of endogamy strongly suggested a limited ability to discern and resist paternal authority. Jason Beaumont's trial, which began in March 1977, became one of the most notorious in Louisiana's judicial history. The defense argued insanity based on family history and extreme isolation, but the jury did not accept this. In May 1977, Jason was sentenced to multiple penalties amounting to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. During the trial, even more disturbing details surfaced. Jason was found to have an elaborate belief system, documented in dozens of notebooks, in which he believed his family was chosen to maintain a pure lineage isolated from the outside world's contamination. Jason Beaumont's writings reveal a completely distorted worldview, analyzes Dr. Paul Robichaud, a forensic psychiatrist who examined the documents. He had created a family mythology where isolation and endogamic practices were not only acceptable but necessary for the spiritual survival of the lineage. The fate of the Beaumont children became a primary concern. Due to their complex medical needs and psychological trauma, most were referred to specialized institutions. Efforts to find adoptive families faced significant challenges due to the children's medical conditions and the stigma associated with the case. Emma, Sarah's sister, was sent to an institution for the visually impaired in Baton Rouge, where she finally received adequate treatment. Years later, in a 1992 interview, she provided valuable insights. "We grew up believing the outside world was dangerous. Our father said we could only trust family, that everyone else wanted to separate and destroy our way of life. When you hear that every day in complete isolation, you believe it." Sarah Beaumont spent 2 years in a psychiatric institution before being considered able to face a reduced judgment. Given her status as a victim and the psychological assessments confirming her limited ability to resist, she received a suspended sentence and was sent to a supervised rehabilitation program. In 1985, nearly a decade after the trial, a team of geneticists from Tulane University published a detailed study on the Beaumont family's genetic patterns, which became a reference in scientific literature on the effects of extreme consanguinity. The Beaumont case represents one of the most extreme examples of multigenerational endogamy ever documented in modern medical literature, wrote Dr. James Monroe, the study's lead author. The coefficient of consanguinity of Jason and Sarah's children significantly exceeded any other previously reported case, resulting in an almost catastrophic expression of deleterious recessive characteristics. The study identified more than 30 distinct genetic conditions present in the children. Nearly 50 years have passed since the intervention, but the shock waves of this case continue to reverberate, affecting not only the lives of those involved but also how society understands the dangers of extreme isolation and endogamy. Jason Beaumont died in prison in 1989 at age 57, never showing repentance or understanding of his actions' severity. He maintained his distorted belief in protecting his family lineage until his last days. After years of intensive care and rehabilitation, Sarah Beaumont was able to build a relatively stable life in a small city in Texas, where she lived under a new identity until her death in 2011 at age 52. According to her long-term therapist, Dr. Richard Hamilton, she never completely overcame the trauma but managed to achieve a level of functionality that allowed her some quality of life. Sarah's case exemplifies both the resilience and the limitations of psychological recovery after extreme trauma. Of the 15 children found on the property in 1976, only 9 survived to adulthood. Their complex medical and psychological challenges made for difficult prognoses. Thomas, one of the youngest who was only 2 when rescued, became an advocate for children in vulnerable situations. Despite his own physical limitations, including severe scoliosis and congenital heart problems, he trained as a social worker. "What happened to my family was not just the result of one disturbed man's actions," Thomas said in a rare 2018 interview. "It was the culmination of generations of isolation, inadequate education, and cultural distortions that allowed destructive patterns to be normalized. Endogamy was only the most evident symptom of a much deeper problem." The Beaumont property, abandoned after the intervention, was completely consumed by a fire in 1980. Some locals claim it was deliberately set to cleanse the site of its disturbing associations. Today, the area has been reclaimed by the swamps, and only the elders remember the exact location. The impact of the Beaumont case extended far beyond Louisiana. The genetic study conducted by Tulane University became reference material in medical courses nationwide. The psychological and sociological aspects are often analyzed in training programs for social workers and child protection professionals. In 1982, partially inspired by this case, Louisiana implemented specific programs to identify and monitor isolated communities to prevent abuse and ensure access to basic services. The most important legacy of the Beaumont case was the awareness of the dangers of extreme isolation, says Dr. Melissa Richards, a social work professor at the University of Louisiana. Before this case, there was a tendency to respect the privacy of reclusive families even when there were worrying signs. Today we understand that isolation can be a significant risk factor for various types of abuse. Scientifically, the case remains one of the most extreme examples of prolonged endogamy's effects in humans. What we observed in the Beaumont family was essentially an unintentional genetic experiment that would never be ethically allowed, explains geneticist Dr. Alan Peterson. The information obtained, though tragic, has assisted in developing genetic tests and counseling for families with a history of hereditary diseases. In 2016, the Beaumont history was included in the medical ethics curriculum of several American universities. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonated with you. Leave a comment saying "I watched here" so I can know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more real cases, stories that reveal the darkest aspects of the human condition. Leave your like on this video and share it with someone who would be interested in this impactful account of the devastating consequences of social isolation and endogamic practices. The history of the Beaumonts serves as a dark reminder of the dangers of extreme isolation and the distortions that can occur when communities separate completely from the broader social fabric. It is also a testimony to human resilience, exemplified by those survivors who, despite almost unimaginable adversity, managed to find meaning and purpose in their lives.